In September of 2017, 28-year-old software engineer David Kellerman disappeared while attempting a solo climb in Glacier National Park. Search teams combed the mountain faces and valleys for 3 weeks, checking every ledge and crevice accessible to rescue equipment, but found no trace of him. Nearly 12 months passed, and when a team of ice researchers conducting routine glacier measurements broke through a previously unknown ice formation near Mount Cleveland, they discovered something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about survival in extreme conditions. Suspended upside down in a natural ice cave, perfectly preserved by sub-zero temperatures, was David Kellerman. He was frozen solid, but the position of his body and the circumstances of his discovery would raise questions that investigators are still trying to answer today. On September 14, 2017, the weather in northwestern Montana was crisp but stable. Early morning temperatures hovered around 35 degrees Fahrenheit, with clear skies and minimal wind conditions that experienced climbers considered ideal for technical ascents. At approximately 6:30 a.m., David Kellerman signed the climbing register at the Polebridge Ranger Station, indicating his planned route up the northeast face of Mount Cleveland. The duty ranger who processed his permit later told investigators that David appeared well-prepared and confident. His gear list included standard mountaineering equipment, ice axes, crampons, a sleeping bag rated for temperatures down to -20 degrees, and enough food for a planned 3-day climb. According to the ranger's notes, David estimated his return date as September 17, giving himself adequate time for weather delays. David was not a novice climber. His roommate in Seattle, James Whitmore, told police that David had been climbing seriously for over 8 years. He had completed technical routes in the Cascades, spent summers in Alaska working on glaciated peaks, and had successfully climbed several challenging faces in the Canadian Rockies. Mount Cleveland, while demanding, was within his skill range. The route he chose was rated as moderately difficult, with well-documented anchor points and established camps used by climbers for decades. This is why his disappearance seems so inexplicable from the beginning. The last confirmed sighting of David occurred at approximately 2 p.m. on September 14. 2 climbers descending from a different route on Mount Cleveland reported seeing a solo climber matching David's description at an elevation of roughly 8,200 feet. According to their statement to park rangers, the climber was moving steadily upward, appeared to be in control of his ascent, and showed no signs of distress. The weather remained stable throughout the afternoon, with no sudden storms or visibility issues that might have contributed to an accident. When David failed to check out by his planned return date of September 17, the Glacier National Park search and rescue team initiated standard protocols. His vehicle, a blue Toyota pickup truck, remained in the Polebridge parking area exactly where he had left it. Inside, investigators found his wallet, cell phone, and a detailed climbing plan that matched the route he had registered with the rangers. There were no signs of struggle or hasty departure. Everything suggested that David had simply vanished somewhere on the mountain. The initial search operation began at dawn on September 18. Teams of experienced mountain rescue specialists, supported by helicopter reconnaissance, began systematic sweeps of David's planned route. They checked established camping areas, technical sections where climbers commonly encounter difficulties, and potential fall zones below cliff faces. Search dogs were brought in to track any scent trail, but the results were inconclusive. The dogs picked up traces near the base of the climb but lost the trail completely above 7,500 feet, as if David had simply stopped existing at that elevation. Weather conditions during the search remained favorable for the first week. Rescue teams were able to access areas that are often impossible to reach due to storms or high winds. They used thermal imaging equipment to scan for body heat, metal detectors to locate climbing gear, and even brought in specialized equipment designed to detect human remains. Volunteers from local climbing communities joined the effort, contributing hundreds of hours of search time. Some of these volunteers knew the mountain intimately and checked remote areas that casual climbers never visit. By the end of the first week, the search had expanded beyond David's planned route. Teams began checking alternative paths he might have taken if weather or route conditions had forced him to change his plan. They examined every accessible ice formation, rock shelter, and potential bivouac site within a 5-mile radius of his last known position. Helicopter crews flew grid patterns over the entire area, photographing every visible detail for later analysis by experts who might spot something the airborne teams had missed. The search continued for 3 full weeks. During this time, rescue teams covered over 40 square miles of mountainous terrain, much of it requiring technical climbing skills to access. They found evidence of other climbers who had passed through the area in recent years, including old gear caches and abandoned equipment, but nothing that belonged to David. The mountain seemed to have absorbed him completely, leaving no trace of his passage beyond the point where the search dogs had lost his scent. On October 8, after 21 days of intensive searching, Glacier National Park officials made the difficult decision to scale back the operation. The official statement cited the approach of winter weather conditions and the exhaustion of all reasonable search possibilities. In their final report, search coordinators noted that they had covered every accessible area where David could have fallen, become trapped, or sought shelter. The case was transferred to the park's Missing Persons Division, where it would remain open but without active search operations. David's family refused to accept that the search was over. His parents, Robert and Linda Kellerman, traveled from their home in Oregon to establish a temporary base in the area. They organized private search efforts, hired independent mountain guides, and offered substantial rewards for any information about their son's whereabouts. These private searches continued sporadically throughout the fall of 2017, but winter weather eventually made further efforts impossible. The case attracted attention from climbing communities across the country. David's disappearance was featured in mountaineering magazines and online forums where experienced climbers discussed possible scenarios. Some suggested that he might have fallen into a hidden crevasse. Others theorized about avalanche burial or equipment failure in a location too remote for searchers to find. A few proposed that David might have survived initially but become trapped in a place where rescue was impossible, eventually succumbing to exposure or injury. Local newspapers covered the story extensively during the search period. The Kalispell Daily Interlake published several articles about the operation, including interviews with search team leaders and David's family members. One article quoted the search coordinator as saying that David's disappearance was among the most puzzling he had encountered in 20 years of mountain rescue work. Unlike most climbing accidents, which leave some evidence of what occurred, David's case provided no clues about what had gone wrong or where it had happened. As winter settled over Glacier National Park, the search for David Kellerman entered a dormant phase. Snow covered the mountains, making further ground searches impossible until the following spring. His family maintained hope that he might have found shelter and survived, but rescue experts privately acknowledged that the chances of survival through a Montana winter in the mountains were virtually zero. The case file remained open, but active investigation ceased. Throughout the winter months, David's disappearance continued to puzzle those who knew the mountain well. Experienced guides and longtime park rangers discussed the case in informal settings, trying to understand how an experienced climber could vanish so completely on a well-traveled route. Some mentioned that Mount Cleveland had a history of unusual incidents, but nothing comparable to a complete disappearance without any trace evidence. The spring of 2018 brought renewed hope for David's family. As snow melted and climbing routes became accessible again, they organized new search efforts focused on areas that had been impossible to reach during the previous fall's operation. These searches were smaller in scale but covered some extremely remote locations that the official teams had not been able to access. Volunteers included some of the most experienced mountaineers in the region, people who knew every hidden corner of the Glacier National Park backcountry. These spring searches yielded no new information about David's fate. The mountain had kept its secret through the winter, and the melting snow revealed nothing that had been hidden beneath. By summer 2018, even David's most determined supporters began to acknowledge that they might never learn what had happened to him. The case seemed destined to join the ranks of unsolved disappearances that occur in wilderness areas across the country each year. It was during this period of resigned acceptance that a completely unrelated scientific expedition would stumble upon a discovery that would reopen David Kellerman's case in the most unexpected way possible. The researchers had no idea that their routine glacier measurements would lead them to a frozen chamber containing answers to questions that had haunted David's family and the climbing community for nearly a year. Dr. Amanda Pierce and her team from the University of Montana's Glaciology Department arrived at Glacier National Park on August 15, 2018, for what they expected to be a routine ice measurement expedition. Their research focused on documenting the retreat of glacial formations in response to climate change, work that required precise measurements of ice thickness and density at various elevations. The team consisted of Dr. Pierce, graduate student Kevin Walsh, and research technician Lisa Brennan. They had been conducting similar studies throughout the Northern Rockies for 3 years, and their work at Glacier represented the final phase of a comprehensive regional survey. The team's equipment included ground-penetrating radar, ice core drilling apparatus, and thermal imaging devices designed to map subsurface ice formations. Their planned study area encompassed several glacial remnants on the north face of Mount Cleveland, including formations that had not been thoroughly documented in previous surveys. According to Dr. Pierce's research notes, they were particularly interested in measuring ice caves and chambers that formed naturally within the glacial mass, as these features provided valuable data about internal ice dynamics and structural stability. On August 22, the team was working at an elevation of approximately 9,100 feet, using ground-penetrating radar to map the internal structure of a glacial formation that appeared stable from the surface. The radar readings indicated a large void space approximately 15 feet below the ice surface, which was not unusual in glacial environments. Such cavities often formed when meltwater carved channels through the ice or when shifting ice masses created internal gaps. Dr. Pierce decided to investigate the cavity more thoroughly, as its size and depth made it potentially significant for their research data. The team began drilling an access hole using their ice core equipment, modified with a larger diameter bit designed for creating entry points into subsurface cavities. The drilling process proceeded normally for the first 12 feet, with the equipment encountering the expected density of glacial ice. However, at a depth of 14 feet, the drill suddenly broke through into open space, indicating that they had reached the cavity detected by their radar equipment. Kevin Walsh was the first to peer down into the hole they had created. Using a high-powered LED flashlight, he attempted to assess the size and characteristics of the cavity below. According to his statement to investigators, the beam of his flashlight revealed a chamber much larger than their radar had suggested, with smooth ice walls that reflected the light in unusual patterns. As he adjusted the angle of his light to examine different sections of the chamber, the beam illuminated something that made him immediately call for Dr. Pierce. Suspended from the ceiling of the ice cave, approximately 8 feet below the access hole, was what appeared to be a human figure. The body was hanging upside down, held in place by what looked like climbing rope wrapped around the ankles. The figure was completely encased in a thin layer of ice, creating a translucent coating that preserved every detail of clothing and equipment. Kevin's first reaction, according to his testimony, was disbelief. He called Dr. Pierce to confirm what he was seeing, thinking that the strange lighting conditions in the ice cave might be creating an optical illusion. Dr. Pierce's examination confirmed Kevin's observation. Through the access hole, she could clearly see a human body suspended in an inverted position within the ice chamber. The person appeared to be wearing mountaineering gear, including a distinctive red jacket and climbing helmet. The body's position was unnatural, suggesting that it had not arrived in the chamber through any normal climbing accident. The rope around the ankles appeared to be deliberately tied, and the suspension point was a metal anchor that had been driven into the ice ceiling of the chamber. The team immediately ceased their research activities and contacted Glacier National Park authorities. Dr. Pierce used her satellite communication device to reach the park's emergency dispatch center, reporting the discovery of human remains in an ice cave on Mount Cleveland. The dispatcher initially had difficulty understanding the nature of the discovery, as reports of bodies found in ice formations were extremely rare in the park's history. Dr. Pierce provided precise GPS coordinates and detailed descriptions of the access route to the site. Park rangers arrived at the location within 4 hours of the initial report. The response team included Chief Ranger Thomas Briggs, who had supervised the search for David Kellerman the previous year, and 2 technical rescue specialists equipped for ice cave operations. Ranger Briggs immediately recognized the significance of the discovery's location, which was within the general area where David had disappeared, though at a much higher elevation than searchers had previously examined. The initial assessment of the scene required lowering a ranger into the ice chamber through the access hole created by the research team. Ranger Michael Torres, an experienced ice rescue specialist, descended into the cavity using specialized equipment designed for confined space operations. His preliminary examination confirmed that the suspended figure was indeed human remains, preserved by the constant sub-zero temperatures within the ice cave. The body appeared to be that of a young male, wearing gear consistent with mountaineering equipment from the previous year. Torres's report, filed that evening, described the scene in detail. The ice chamber was roughly circular, approximately 12 feet in diameter and 8 feet in height. The walls were smooth glacial ice, formed by natural processes over many years. The suspended body was positioned in the exact center of the chamber, hanging from a single anchor point in the ceiling. The rope used for suspension was standard climbing rope, showing no signs of wear or damage that would suggest accidental entanglement. Most disturbing was the deliberate nature of the suspension system, which appeared to have been carefully constructed rather than resulting from any climbing accident. The recovery operation began the following morning. Due to the delicate nature of the scene and the need to preserve evidence, the team decided to enlarge the access hole rather than attempt to remove the body through the narrow opening created by the research team. This process required careful use of heated tools to avoid damaging either the ice formation or the remains within the chamber. The work proceeded slowly, with frequent stops to photograph and document every aspect of the scene before any alterations were made. As the access hole was enlarged, additional details became visible. The suspended figure was wearing a red mountaineering jacket with distinctive yellow trim, climbing pants and mountaineering boots. A climbing helmet remained secured to the head, and a small backpack was still attached to the body's back. Most significantly, the gear matched descriptions provided by David Kellerman's family during the previous year's search operation. Ranger Briggs, who had supervised that search, immediately recognized the clothing as consistent with David's known equipment. The actual recovery of the body required specialized techniques due to its suspended position and the fragile nature of ice-preserved remains. The team used a combination of heated tools and careful manual work to free the suspension rope from its anchor point in the ice ceiling. Throughout this process, they documented the exact configuration of the rope system, noting that it consisted of multiple wraps around both ankles and a complex knot system that secured the rope to the overhead anchor. When the body was finally lowered to the chamber floor, investigators could examine it more closely. The preservation was remarkable, with facial features clearly visible through the thin ice coating. Personal items found with the body included a wallet containing David Kellerman's identification, confirming what many had already suspected. However, the condition and position of the remains raised immediate questions about how David had ended up suspended in this remote ice chamber. The body was carefully transported to the surface and then evacuated by helicopter to the medical examiner's office in Kalispell. The entire recovery operation took 2 days, with investigators working in shifts to ensure that no evidence was overlooked or damaged during the process. Every piece of equipment found with the body was cataloged and preserved for analysis, including the rope system that had held David in his suspended position. News of the discovery spread quickly through the climbing community and local media. David's family was notified before any public announcements were made, giving them time to process the news privately. However, the unusual circumstances of the discovery ensured that the story would attract significant attention once it became public knowledge. The image of a climber found suspended upside down in an ice cave captured public imagination and raised questions about what had happened during David's final hours on the mountain. Initial medical examination confirmed that the remains were those of David Kellerman, ending nearly a year of uncertainty about his fate. However, the examination also revealed details that deepened the mystery surrounding his death. The position of the body, the deliberate nature of the suspension system, and the remote location of the ice chamber all suggested that David's death had not resulted from a typical climbing accident. Instead, investigators found themselves confronting evidence that pointed toward something far more disturbing and inexplicable than anyone had anticipated when the search for David first began. The medical examiner's initial report, completed 3 days after David Kellerman's body was recovered from the ice cave, contained findings that immediately elevated the case from a missing person investigation to a potential homicide. Dr. Margaret Hoffman, the chief medical examiner for Flathead County, had processed hundreds of cases involving deaths in wilderness areas, but she noted in her preliminary assessment that David's case presented unique challenges due to both the preservation conditions and the circumstances of discovery. The autopsy revealed that David had suffered multiple injuries prior to death, including fractured ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and severe bruising on his torso and limbs. However, the pattern of these injuries was inconsistent with a typical climbing fall or avalanche burial. Dr. Hoffman's report stated that the injuries appeared to have been inflicted over a period of time rather than in a single traumatic event. Most significantly, the fractures showed signs of partial healing, indicating that David had survived for several days or possibly weeks after sustaining the initial injuries. The cause of death was determined to be hypothermia, but the circumstances surrounding the onset of fatal exposure raised disturbing questions. David's clothing was intact and appropriate for mountain conditions. His gear showed no signs of damage that would have compromised his ability to maintain body temperature, and his position in the ice cave should have provided some protection from wind and precipitation. Dr. Hoffman noted that healthy individuals wearing proper gear rarely succumb to hypothermia in sheltered environments unless other factors prevent them from maintaining body heat through movement or other warming techniques. The rope system used to suspend David's body became a focal point of the investigation. Forensic analysis revealed that the rope was David's own climbing rope, identified through manufacturer markings and wear patterns that matched equipment descriptions provided by his climbing partners. However, the knot configuration used to secure his ankles was not a standard climbing knot. Instead, investigators found a complex binding system that appeared designed specifically to prevent escape rather than to provide climbing security. Detective Ray Hutchinson of the Flathead County Sheriff's Office was assigned as lead investigator on the case. His background included 15 years of experience with violent crimes and several cases involving deaths in wilderness areas. In his initial case notes, Detective Hutchinson wrote that the evidence suggested David had been deliberately restrained and left to die in the ice cave. The question that immediately arose was who could have accomplished this in such a remote location and why they would have chosen such an elaborate method. The investigation team returned to the ice cave for a more thorough examination of the scene. Using specialized lighting and photography equipment, they documented every detail of the chamber's interior. The ice walls showed no tool marks or signs of artificial excavation, confirming that the cave was a natural formation. However, investigators found several items that had not been immediately visible during the recovery operation. These included a small camping stove, empty food containers, and a sleeping bag that did not belong to David. The presence of these additional items suggested that someone had used the ice cave as a temporary shelter, possibly for an extended period. The food containers bore no identifying marks, but their condition indicated recent use. The sleeping bag was a military surplus model, different from the civilian gear typically used by recreational climbers. Most intriguingly, investigators found a small notebook wrapped in plastic, hidden in a crevice near the back of the chamber. The notebook contained handwritten entries spanning several weeks in September 2017, beginning just days after David's disappearance. The handwriting was cramped and difficult to read, but forensic analysts were able to decipher most of the text. The entries described daily activities in the ice cave, including observations about weather conditions, food rationing, and what appeared to be surveillance of climbing activity on the mountain below. Several entries specifically mentioned David, referring to him as the subject, and documenting his condition over time. One entry, dated September 20th, read, "Subject showing signs of delirium. Injuries from initial capture healing slowly. Cave temperature maintaining preservation conditions. Must maintain observation protocols." Another entry from September 25 stated, "Subject no longer responsive to verbal commands. Hypothermia progressing as expected. Documentation phase nearly complete." The clinical tone of these observations suggested that David's captivity and death had been part of some kind of deliberate experiment or study. The notebook also contained detailed sketches of the ice cave's interior, including measurements and notes about structural features. These drawings showed a level of familiarity with the location that could only have come from extended observation and planning. Most disturbing were several sketches of David in his suspended position, drawn from different angles and annotated with notes about rope tension and body positioning. The sketches suggested that his captor had spent considerable time perfecting the suspension system. Detective Hutchinson expanded the investigation to include analysis of all climbing permits issued for the Mount Cleveland area during September 2017. The goal was to identify anyone who might have been in the vicinity during the time period covered by the notebook entries. This process revealed that several other climbers had registered for routes in the general area, but most had completed their climbs and departed before David's disappearance. However, one permit stood out as potentially significant. A permit had been issued on September 10 to someone identifying himself as Dr. Carl Brenner, claiming to be conducting glaciological research for the University of Alaska. The permit was for an extended stay of up to 30 days, covering the entire period of David's disappearance and captivity. However, when investigators contacted the University of Alaska, they found no record of any Dr. Carl Brenner on their faculty or research staff. The address provided on the permit application led to a vacant lot in Anchorage, and the phone number was disconnected. The false permit application suggested that David's captor had planned the operation well in advance, creating a legitimate cover story that would allow extended access to the remote area without arousing suspicion. The 30-day permit duration also aligned with the timeline suggested by the notebook entries, indicating that the entire sequence of events had been carefully orchestrated rather than opportunistic. Investigators began searching for any trace of the mysterious Dr. Brenner in the area around Glacier National Park. They checked local motels, camping areas, and equipment rental shops for anyone matching the description provided on the permit application. The description was generic, a middle-aged white male of average height and build, but investigators hoped that someone might remember unusual behavior or requests for specialized equipment. The search for Dr. Brenner led investigators to a small outdoor equipment shop in Whitefish, Montana, about 40 miles from Glacier National Park. The shop owner, Gary Novak, remembered a customer who had purchased an unusual combination of items in early September 2017. The customer had bought rope, carabiners, and other climbing hardware, but had also purchased items not typically associated with mountaineering, including military-style rations, medical supplies, and a portable weather radio. Novak's description of the customer matched the general details from the permit application, but he remembered additional details that proved significant to the investigation. The customer had paid cash for all purchases and had asked specific questions about the durability of rope in sub-zero conditions. Most memorably, he had inquired about the shop's return policy for unused equipment, suggesting that he planned to return items after a specific period of use. The investigation team also discovered that someone matching Dr. Brenner's description had been seen at several locations around the park during September 2017. A gas station attendant in West Glacier remembered a customer who had purchased large quantities of fuel and had asked detailed questions about road access to remote areas of the park. A campground host at Apgar reported a camper who had stayed for several days but had been notably secretive about his activities, leaving early each morning with a large backpack and returning after dark. These sightings created a timeline that aligned with the notebook entries and David's known movements. It appeared that Dr. Brenner, whoever he really was, had been conducting surveillance of climbing activity in the area for several days before David's arrival. The level of preparation and planning suggested that David had not been a random victim but had been specifically targeted for reasons that remained unclear. As investigators pieced together more details about the mysterious Dr. Brenner, they began to develop a profile of someone with extensive outdoor experience, detailed knowledge of the local area, and access to specialized equipment. The clinical nature of the notebook entries suggested possible medical or scientific training, while the sophisticated planning indicated someone with experience in covert operations. However, despite these insights, the identity of David's captor remained unknown, and investigators found themselves pursuing a ghost who had vanished as completely as David himself had initially disappeared. The case attracted attention from federal law enforcement agencies due to its unusual nature and the possibility that the perpetrator might strike again in other wilderness areas. FBI behavioral analysts reviewed the evidence and concluded that the crime showed characteristics of someone conducting human experimentation, possibly as part of a larger pattern of similar activities. This assessment led to a nationwide search for comparable cases involving missing climbers or hikers found in unusual circumstances. The FBI's involvement in the David Kellerman case brought resources and expertise that local investigators had not previously accessed. Special Agent Rebecca Torres, who specialized in crimes occurring in remote wilderness areas, arrived in Kalispell on September 15, 2018, to coordinate the federal investigation. Her background included cases involving serial offenders who targeted outdoor enthusiasts, and she immediately recognized patterns in David's case that suggested the perpetrator might have committed similar crimes elsewhere. Agent Torres initiated a comprehensive search of the FBI's database for unsolved cases involving missing or deceased hikers and climbers found in unusual circumstances. The search parameters included victims discovered in remote locations, evidence of prolonged captivity, and any indication of deliberate positioning or staging of remains. Within 2 weeks, the database search had identified 17 cases across 7 western states that shared similarities with David's situation, spanning a period of nearly 8 years. The most compelling match was the case of Jennifer Walsh, a 26-year-old rock climber who had disappeared in Olympic National Park in Washington state during August 2015. Jennifer's body had been discovered 6 months after her disappearance by park maintenance workers who were clearing a blocked drainage tunnel. She had been found in a seated position, secured to a metal pipe with climbing rope, in a location that required technical expertise to access. Like David, Jennifer had survived for an extended period after her initial disappearance, and her death had ultimately resulted from exposure and dehydration. Another significant case involved Marcus Reed, a 31-year-old mountaineer who had vanished in Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado during September 2016. Marcus had been found the following spring by a search and rescue team investigating an unrelated incident. His body was discovered in a natural cave system, suspended from the ceiling in a manner remarkably similar to David's positioning. The Colorado investigators had initially treated the case as an unusual climbing accident, but the FBI's review revealed details that suggested deliberate restraint and captivity. Agent Torres established a task force to investigate what appeared to be a pattern of crimes committed by the same individual across multiple states. The task force included investigators from each jurisdiction where similar cases had occurred, creating a coordinated effort to share information and identify connections between the various incidents. The working theory was that a single perpetrator was targeting experienced climbers and hikers, using wilderness areas as both hunting grounds and disposal sites for his victims. The geographic distribution of the cases revealed a pattern that suggested the perpetrator was highly mobile and familiar with remote wilderness areas across the western United States. The crimes had occurred in national parks and wilderness areas from Washington to New Mexico, always in locations that required significant outdoor skills to access. This mobility suggested someone with extensive outdoor experience, possibly a professional guide, researcher, or someone whose work required regular travel to remote locations. Analysis of the timeline between incidents showed that the perpetrator typically allowed several months to pass between crimes, possibly to avoid detection or to scout new locations. The crimes also showed a seasonal pattern, with most occurring during late summer or early fall when weather conditions were favorable for extended outdoor activities. This timing suggested that the perpetrator planned his activities around optimal conditions for both accessing remote areas and maintaining victims in outdoor environments. The task force's investigation revealed that in several cases, false permits or registrations had been used to gain legitimate access to restricted areas. In Olympic National Park, investigators found records of a research permit issued to a Dr. William Hayes from Oregon State University, but the university had no record of such a person. In Rocky Mountain National Park, a similar permit had been issued to Dr. Michael Foster, supposedly conducting wildlife research for Colorado State University, but this identity also proved to be fabricated. The pattern of false academic credentials suggested that the perpetrator had extensive knowledge of how research permits were processed and what documentation was required to gain access to restricted areas. This knowledge, combined with the clinical nature of the notebook found in David's case, led investigators to theorize that the perpetrator might have legitimate academic or research credentials that he was using as a foundation for creating false identities. Dr. Patricia Vance, a forensic psychologist consulted by the task force, developed a behavioral profile of the perpetrator based on the evidence from all related cases. Her analysis suggested that the crimes were motivated by a desire to study human behavior under extreme stress conditions, possibly as part of some form of psychological research or experimentation. The careful documentation found in David's case, combined with similar evidence from other incidents, indicated that the perpetrator viewed his victims as test subjects rather than random targets. The profile described someone with advanced education, likely in psychology, medicine, or a related field, who had become obsessed with studying human responses to isolation and extreme conditions. Dr. Vance noted that the perpetrator's methods showed sophisticated understanding of both human psychology and wilderness survival techniques. The choice to use remote wilderness locations suggested someone who was not only comfortable in such environments but who viewed them as ideal laboratories for his experiments. Meanwhile, the investigation into Dr. Carl Brenner's true identity continued through traditional detective work. Investigators obtained surveillance footage from businesses around Glacier National Park during September 2017, hoping to identify the person who had used the false identity. The process was tedious, requiring review of hundreds of hours of footage from gas stations, restaurants, and equipment shops in the area. A breakthrough came when investigators reviewed footage from a bank ATM in Whitefish, Montana, dated September 8, 2017. The footage showed a man matching Dr. Brenner's description making a cash withdrawal using a debit card. The transaction provided investigators with their first concrete lead, as the card was linked to an account registered to Thomas Aldrich, a 45-year-old former university researcher from Portland, Oregon. Background investigation revealed that Thomas Aldrich had worked as a research psychologist at Portland State University until 2014, when he had been dismissed following allegations of conducting unauthorized experiments on human subjects. The university's internal investigation had found that Aldrich had been secretly studying stress responses in student volunteers without proper consent or oversight. Although criminal charges had not been filed at the time, the university had terminated his employment and banned him from campus. After his dismissal from Portland State, Aldrich had disappeared from public records. He had sold his house, closed his bank accounts, and ceased all contact with former colleagues and acquaintances. Investigators found that he had been living off the grid for several years, using cash transactions and false identities to avoid detection. The bank account used in Whitefish was one of several accounts he had opened under different names, funded through a complex network of financial transactions designed to obscure his activities. The discovery of Aldrich's true identity provided investigators with their first clear suspect, but locating him proved challenging. He had no permanent address, no regular employment, and no digital footprint that could be traced through normal investigative methods. The task force expanded their search to include analysis of financial records, vehicle registrations, and any other documentation that might reveal his current whereabouts. Investigators also began examining Aldrich's academic background and published research to understand his motivations and methods. His doctoral dissertation, completed at the University of Washington in 2003, had focused on psychological responses to isolation and sensory deprivation. His early research had been conducted within ethical guidelines, but colleagues who were interviewed described him as increasingly obsessed with pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable in human subjects research. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who had worked with Aldrich at Portland State before his dismissal, told investigators that he had become fixated on studying what he called authentic stress responses that could only be observed when subjects were unaware they were being studied. He had argued that traditional laboratory research was inadequate because subjects modified their behavior when they knew they were being observed. This philosophy appeared to have evolved into the systematic targeting and study of unwilling victims in wilderness settings. The task force also discovered that Aldrich had extensive outdoor experience that predated his academic career. He had worked as a wilderness guide in Alaska during his graduate school years and had completed advanced training in mountaineering and wilderness survival. This background explained his ability to operate effectively in remote areas and to overpower experienced outdoor enthusiasts like David Kellerman. As the investigation progressed, the task force developed a comprehensive understanding of Aldrich's methods and motivations, but his current location remained unknown. The pattern of his crimes suggested that he was likely scouting new locations for future activities, possibly in wilderness areas that had not yet been connected to his previous crimes. This possibility led to increased surveillance and security measures in national parks across the western United States, as investigators worked to prevent additional victims while continuing their search for Thomas Aldrich. The case had evolved from a single missing person investigation into a multi-state manhunt for a serial killer who used America's most remote wilderness areas as his hunting grounds. The challenge facing investigators was finding someone who had spent years perfecting the art of disappearing into landscapes where even experienced searchers could vanish without a trace. The manhunt for Thomas Aldrich intensified throughout the fall of 2018, with federal agents coordinating surveillance operations across multiple wilderness areas where his established pattern suggested he might strike next. Agent Torres implemented a strategy that combined traditional investigative techniques with innovative approaches designed specifically for tracking someone who operated in remote wilderness environments. The FBI established monitoring stations at key access points to major wilderness areas, focusing on locations that matched Aldrich's previous target selection criteria. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source. On November 3, 2018, a backcountry ranger in Yellowstone National Park reported suspicious activity near a remote research station in the park's northeastern section. Ranger Dale Murphy had discovered evidence of unauthorized camping in an area that required special permits for overnight stays. The campsite showed signs of extended occupation, including a sophisticated shelter system and equipment caches that suggested someone had been living there for several weeks. Murphy's report described finding research materials and documentation that immediately caught the attention of investigators. Among the items discovered were detailed topographical maps marked with observation points, photographs of hikers and climbers taken with telephoto lenses, and notebooks containing behavioral observations written in the same clinical style found in David Kellerman's case. Most significantly, the campsite contained identification documents for Dr. Carl Brenner, the false identity Aldrich had used at Glacier National Park. The FBI task force mobilized immediately upon receiving Murphy's report. A joint operation involving federal agents, park rangers, and local law enforcement was organized to locate and apprehend Aldrich before he could abandon the area or claim another victim. The operation required careful coordination to avoid alerting Aldrich to their presence while ensuring that all possible escape routes were covered. Agent Torres arrived at Yellowstone within hours of the initial report, bringing with her a team of specialists trained in wilderness operations and fugitive apprehension. The team included tracking experts, wilderness survival specialists, and behavioral analysts who could help predict Aldrich's likely movements and responses to pressure. The operation was complicated by the remote location and the need to maintain operational security in an environment where radio communications were limited and weather conditions could change rapidly. The search for Aldrich's current location began with a careful examination of the abandoned campsite. Forensic specialists documented every item found at the location, looking for clues about his recent activities and possible destinations. The photographs discovered at the site were particularly revealing, showing that Aldrich had been conducting surveillance of several hiking groups that had passed through the area during the previous weeks. The images suggested that he was in the process of selecting his next victim when the ranger's discovery had forced him to abandon his base of operations. Tracking specialists examined the area around the campsite for signs of Aldrich's departure route. They found footprints leading away from the camp toward a series of thermal features that characterized this section of Yellowstone. The tracks were relatively fresh, suggesting that Aldrich had abandoned the site within the previous 24 to 48 hours. The direction of travel indicated that he was moving deeper into the wilderness rather than toward any of the park's exit points. The pursuit team followed the track evidence through increasingly difficult terrain, moving carefully to avoid detection while maintaining visual contact with the trail. The tracks led through areas of geothermal activity where the ground conditions made tracking challenging, but the specialists were able to maintain the trail by identifying disturbed vegetation and other subtle signs of passage. After several hours of careful pursuit, the team reached a vantage point that provided a clear view of the valley below. Using high-powered binoculars, team members spotted a figure moving along a distant ridgeline approximately 2 miles ahead of their position. The figure appeared to be carrying a large backpack and was moving with the steady pace of someone experienced in wilderness travel. Agent Torres made the decision to coordinate a containment operation, positioning team members at strategic points to prevent Aldrich from escaping the area while a smaller group continued direct pursuit. The containment operation required precise timing and communication despite the challenging terrain and limited radio coverage. Team members moved to positions that would block access to the main trails leading out of the area, while others established observation posts that could monitor Aldrich's movements and coordinate the final approach. The operation was complicated by the need to avoid civilian hikers who might be in the area and could potentially become hostages if Aldrich became aware of the pursuit. As the pursuit team closed the distance to their target, they were able to confirm that the figure was indeed Thomas Aldrich. Through telephoto lenses, they could see that he was carrying equipment consistent with his previous operations, including rope, camping gear, and what appeared to be restraint devices. Most concerning was the presence of surveillance equipment that suggested he was actively scouting for potential victims even while being pursued. The final approach began at dawn on November 5th. With team members moving into position under cover of early morning darkness. Agent Torres coordinated the operation from a command post established on high ground overlooking the target area. The plan called for a simultaneous approach from multiple directions, designed to prevent Aldrich from escaping while minimizing the risk of a violent confrontation in the dangerous terrain. Aldrich was located at a temporary camp he had established in a narrow canyon that provided natural concealment from aerial observation. The camp showed the same level of organization and planning that had characterized his previous operations, with carefully positioned equipment and clear sight lines to monitor approaching threats. However, the canyon location that provided concealment also limited his escape options, allowing the pursuit team to establish a secure perimeter. The arrest operation began when Agent Torres used a bullhorn to identify herself and demand Aldrich's surrender. His initial response was to attempt escape through a narrow passage at the back of the canyon, but team members positioned there were able to block his route without direct confrontation. After a tense standoff lasting nearly 2 hours, during which Aldrich made several unsuccessful attempts to find alternative escape routes, he finally surrendered without violence. The arrest of Thomas Aldrich brought closure to the families of David Kellerman and the other victims whose cases had been linked to his activities. However, the investigation revealed that his crimes had been even more extensive than initially suspected. During the search of his various campsites and equipment caches, investigators found evidence connecting him to additional disappearances that had not previously been identified as related cases. Aldrich's eventual confession, provided during plea negotiations, revealed the full scope of his activities over nearly a decade. He admitted to the murders of David Kellerman and 16 other victims across 7 states, describing his crimes as research into human psychological responses under extreme conditions. His detailed records, recovered from multiple locations, provided investigators with information about victims whose remains had never been found and cases that had been classified as missing persons rather than homicides. The psychological evaluation conducted during Aldrich's prosecution revealed a complex individual whose academic training had been corrupted by an obsessive desire to study human suffering without ethical constraints. Dr. Patricia Vance, who conducted the evaluation, described him as a highly intelligent individual who had rationalized his crimes as legitimate scientific research, despite understanding that his actions were illegal and harmful. Thomas Aldrich was ultimately sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for his crimes. The case led to significant changes in how research permits are processed for wilderness areas, with enhanced background checks and verification procedures designed to prevent similar deceptions. The FBI also established new protocols for investigating disappearances in wilderness areas, recognizing that such locations can be used by predators who exploit the isolation and limited law enforcement presence. For David Kellerman's family, the resolution of the case provided answers to questions that had haunted them for over a year, but it could not restore what they had lost. His parents, Robert and Linda Kellerman, established a foundation dedicated to improving safety and communication systems for wilderness recreation, working to prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies. The foundation also supports research into improving search and rescue techniques for wilderness areas. The case of David Kellerman and Thomas Aldrich serves as a reminder that even in America's most remote and beautiful wilderness areas, human predators can exploit the isolation and vulnerability of outdoor enthusiasts. The investigation revealed how someone with the right combination of skills, knowledge, and malicious intent could operate undetected for years in environments where help is far away and victims can disappear without a trace. The ice cave where David was found has been permanently sealed by the National Park Service, both to preserve it as a crime scene and to prevent it from becoming a site of morbid curiosity. The location remains unmarked and undisclosed to the public, known only to investigators and park officials who were involved in the case. Mount Cleveland continues to attract climbers and hikers, but David's story has become part of the mountain's history, a reminder of the dangers that can lurk even in the most pristine wilderness settings. The legacy of this case extends beyond the individual tragedy of David Kellerman's death. It has changed how law enforcement agencies approach missing person cases in wilderness areas, how park services process research permits, and how the outdoor recreation community thinks about safety in remote locations. While the wilderness will always carry inherent risks, the lessons learned from David's case have made these environments safer for the thousands of people who seek adventure and solitude in America's wild places.